Hello students, and welcome back to another lecture for Core 201. So today, we are going to talk about Montesquieu. More specifically, here's his whole name. He is Charles Louis de Secondat, Baron de la Breda et de Montesquieu. And it's safe to say that I mispronounced all of that, because I've always been bad at pronouncing French, and I'm not going to start being good at it today. But basically what you need to know about him is that we are just going to call him Montesquieu, and he's clearly very wealthy and very important and very French. So Montesquieu is another one of our wealthy, well-educated guys. He was born into a pretty wealthy family, and his parents died when he was kind of young, so he was the ward of his uncle, who was the actual Baron de la Brede, and then when his uncle died, he inherited that title. So after his excellent education, he basically inherited the title and a position in French government. So at the time, it was often nobility who served in the courts as like judges and lawyers and clerks and that sort of thing. And so that's what our boy Montesquieu did. So growing up with this kind of wealth had a lot of advantages. As you can see here, he had a literal castle. It seems nice. It has a moat. And growing up with that wealth and that level of education was a very important thing for him, because he was able to read all the great works, and eventually he was able to write one of his own. But at a certain point, he got tired of it, and so he sold his position instead of just quitting, which is amazing, and left France. And so he began to sort of travel around Western Europe, looking at different forms of government and thinking about what might work. Europe was in a lot of unrest at the time, and this is something that's kind of important to understand about the world in which he was living and what he thought he should do in the future. So basically what's going on is that the British government is in a huge upheaval. They've just had this whole, revolution. The American colonies are getting ready for their own revolution. France itself was experiencing a certain amount of unrest because their king had recently died and a 5-year-old had taken the throne. So basically he's looking at a lot of governments that are switching from a monarchy to a democracy. And he's sort of wondering to himself how that's going and what he can do to help. And so as he finishes his travel, at least in part because his eyesight is failing, he goes home to his castle and his moat and settles in to write his masterpiece, The Spirit of the Laws. So this book, The Spirit of the Laws, he published in 1748, but he published it anonymously. And that was a pretty good decision because everyone hated it, except for the people who loved it. But the French government hated it, the Catholic Church outright banned it, and pretty much everybody else thought it was the greatest thing anyone had ever done. So it was kind of an open secret that he wrote it, which is cool. But while he was writing it, he was really trying to think about the best way to have a democracy, the best way to have a government. And a lot of the stuff that he put into this book was foundational, not just for our Constitution, but for most democracies, especially in the Western world, ever since. Jefferson was a noted superfan. So The Spirit of the Laws is a pretty big chunk of a book, and we are, of course, only going to read a little bit of it. But it's a really important work in terms of Western literature and what we think we should do when we're setting up a government. So one of his major contributions was this idea of the separation of powers. And what that means is that no one person should have every single job. Instead, you should sort of spread the power out among a bunch of people. So we're going to dig really hard into that concept today and talk all about where he got this idea and what he thought a government should look like, because he was very specific. So we start with Book 6, Chapter 6, The English Constitution. So in this chapter, he basically explains why he thinks the certain parts of government should be separate from each other. So first, let's look at the definitions. So he says, in every government, there are 3 sorts of powers: the legislative, the executive in regard to those matters determined by the laws of nations, and the executive in regard to those matters determined by civil law. So essentially his argument is that every government needs to break itself into these branches, needs to separate the power and kind of spread it out. So first he talks about the legislative branch, and he says, by virtue of the first, the ruler or magistrate makes laws, either temporarily or for all time, as well as correcting and abrogating those already in existence. So the very first piece of government he lays out are the people who make the laws. And he does say that they can also change laws if there are bad ones, and they can also just get rid of laws that are pretty bad and don't deserve a place in our society. The second part, he describes as the executive. By virtue of the second, he makes war or peace, sends or receives ambassadors, ensures security, and makes provision against invasion. This is called simply the executive power of the state. And this should sound pretty familiar, because this is exactly what the executive branch does in the American Constitution. They deal with international politics, they deal with security in terms of like the army, and they're sort of at the top of the chain in terms of like vetoing really bad laws. But other than that, their primary concern is what's going on around the world outside of the world that the Constitution exists in. Third, we have the judicial branch. Essentially, we call it the judicial branch. He talked about it slightly differently. By virtue of the third power, he punishes crimes or passes judgment upon disputes arising from individuals. This is called the judicial power. So again, here we're setting up another branch of government that is solely designed to pass judgment whenever there are arguments or complaints. So those are the three branches. So now we have three branches of government, but here's the trick. They cannot be held by the same person. I know it probably sounds kind of common sense, but bear in mind, someone has to write these things down the first time. And today it's Montesquieu. So essentially his argument is that we used to have the same person have all that power. We used to just have a king. And instead we should distribute that power among several different branches. Because if only one person has it, things can go wrong. What might go wrong, you ask? Let's look at some examples. And buckle up, because my intention is to teach this entire lecture mostly through memes. We'll see how it goes. So the best way to think about what could go wrong if one person had too much power is to kind of examine what would happen if the same person had the branches of each individually. So we're going to kind of look at some examples of what if a person had both of these kinds of powers. So we start with the legislative and executive. So if the same person had both of these powers, what would happen? And he says, when both the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or body of magistrates, there is no liberty. For then it may be feared that the same monarch or senate has made tyrannical laws in order to execute them in a tyrannical way. So what this means is if you let the same person make the laws and execute the laws, you might end up with some very dumb laws and some very harsh punishments. So one example is President Xi Jinping of China. He hates being compared to Winnie the Pooh. I know, but he hates it. It used to be that Winnie the Pooh was not even allowed in China. No likenesses, no Disney films, no Disney stores. It is illegal to make a meme that compares him to Winnie the Pooh. Like, he was kind of serious about this. So here we have an example of he can make the laws and he can enforce the laws. So he can make it illegal to make a meme that compares him to Winnie the Pooh, and he can throw you in jail if you do it. So that's why we can't combine the executive and legislative powers. Next, we have the combination of the judicial and legislative. Were the judicial power joined to the legislative, the life and liberty of the citizens would be subject to arbitrary power. For the judge would then be the legislator. So in this example, we don't want to combine those two powers because it's kind of like when you see some kid making up rules to a game and every time they lose, they change the rules. So you can't let the same person judge the outcome of a thing and then change the laws to fit it. You can't let the same person be in charge of manipulating the laws to fit the judgment that they want to make. So that's why you can't combine the judicial and legislative. Next, we have the judicial and executive. Were the judicial power joined to the executive, the judge could acquire enough strength to become the oppressor. So here, we don't want the same person who passes the sentence to enforce the sentence. So for instance, if you've ever had a teacher who punished the entire class for one person's behavior, that's kind of an example of judging one person guilty and then passing the sentence on everybody else in the room. So if the same person passes the sentence and does the sort of executing of the person, you run the risk of them having too much power. So that's why you can't combine the judicial and the executive. So the thing that's really crucial about this idea of separating the powers is that Montesquieu had seen it go wrong when the same person had all these powers. And he was very concerned with the loss of liberty and the loss of freedom among the normal citizens if the same person had too much power. So he says, "It is no less true that those rulers who have wished to become despots have always begun by uniting in their own persons all the magistracies, and, in the case of many European kings, all the great offices of their state." So you cannot let the same person be the judge and the jury and the executioner, because the odds are really good that they're going to go evil with it. So Montesquieu was very concerned with despots, and despots are sort of like tyrants. It's basically one person who takes over the whole government, but for bad. And he invented the word despotism, which is nice, so that was one of his contributions. But he was very concerned with one bad person getting too much power. So the entirety of this book, and the thing that we're going to focus on for the rest of this lecture, is how to distribute the power so that you can achieve some sort of fairness and liberty for your citizens. So next, Montesquieu launches into how to set up your government so that you can separate these powers. And he starts with the judicial branch, and specifically with juries. And again, this was important to him, because he used to be a judge, and specifically, he used to be a judge in criminal cases, which I think makes sense if you read this. So he starts with this idea about how to have a fair trial, and for that, you need a jury. So, in regard to jury duty, he thinks that it shouldn't be the same set of people all the time. And this is pretty smart. So he says, the judicial power ought not be given to a permanent senate, but should be exercised by persons drawn from the same people as an estate. The court formed this way ought to last no longer than necessity requires. So essentially he's saying that you don't want a permanent jury. You don't want a bunch of people who just sit there and are jury members forever. You want to distribute jury duty among everyone, especially everyone from the same class of people. You also don't want them to just stay there too long. So essentially, you want to make a jury out of people drawn from the estate, ideally random, and then you want them to just come together for the case and go back home. So, why might you want a group of rotating jurors rather than the same jurors all the time? He says because of bias. So he says, in this way, the judicial power, so terrible to men, becomes, as it were, invisible, and of no force, because it is attached neither to any estate nor to any profession. It is the office that is feared, not the individuals who hold it. So essentially, if you have a rotating jury, and it's just made up of all sorts of people, people don't become afraid of the jurors, because the jurors could be anybody. It could be you next week. Instead, they become afraid of the concept of a jury. So you don't want people's professions to kind of interfere with how they act as a jury, and you don't want people to judge their enemies all the time. So instead, you need to put together as unbiased a group as possible. And this can be a bit of a challenge, because it's hard to find people who don't have any bias. But this is why, if you get called for jury duty, you better go. Because if you want an unbiased jury, you have to be a part of an unbiased jury at some point. The next thing that's important about juries is that they use consistent laws. So even though the people are rotating, the laws stay the same. And this is probably one that you can sympathize with. So he says, but although the makeup of tribunals ought not be fixed, the same ought not be true of their judgments, which should be determined only by the precise text of the law. If judgments came to nothing more than the individual opinion of the judge, men would live in society without knowing precisely what were the obligations they had contracted. So this kind of has something to do with promulgation as well. We need to know what the laws are, and the laws need to be the same for every person, because otherwise, how would you know if you're breaking the law? And again, this might sound familiar if your mother perhaps punishes your younger siblings differently than you, or maybe you were the lucky one who was the younger sibling who never got punished. But either way, I think this one makes pretty good sense. The jury might change, but the laws stay the same. The final thing that's important about juries is that they be made up of your peers. So the idea here is that people who are similar to you, especially in wealth and class, will understand your issues better than people who live a totally different life than you live. So he says, the accused ought not be made to think he has fallen into the hands of those inclined to do him violence. Thus, it is not too much to require that his judges be either of the same rank of himself or his peers. And in a sense here, he's talking about social rank in the inherited title sort of sense, and not the way we necessarily think of it today. But it's a pretty good argument. You want to be judged by people who understand the problems that you have, and you don't want to be judged by people who might wish you ill because they're jealous of you. So again, these are pretty logical rules for a jury. Next, we're going to move into the legislative branch and talk about representatives. So what he's designing here is a representative democracy. So it's not an old school democracy where each person gets one vote on every single issue. Instead, we're going to pick some people to go to the capital and represent us. So he says, in a free state, every man who is considered a free citizen ought to be governed by himself. Hence, the people as an estate ought to have the legislative power. However, since that is impossible in large states and subject to many disadvantages in small ones, the people must do by its representatives everything it cannot itself do. So since, for example, America is so large that we couldn't all fit in one place to vote on the same thing, and also if every person had to vote on everything, it would take forever. Instead, representatives. Again, this was such a good idea that we kept it. The thing that is interesting about this is that they can't just be anybody. Each area needs to have their own representatives. And the idea here is that different things are important to different people. And very often, where you are determines what's important to you. So he says, everyone knows much better the needs of his city than those of other cities. He is a better judge of his neighbors' capacities than of those possessed by their other compatriots. Members of the legislative body should not be drawn, therefore, from the nation in general. What is more appropriate is that the inhabitants of every place of importance elect a representative. So instead of just drawing representatives from random from everywhere in the nation, each geographical place should send their own person. And again, this has to do with understanding the needs of the people where you are, even if you don't understand the needs of everybody everywhere. And this is something that continues to be true. America is very divided between our urban and rural populations, and so it's important for us to have representatives who understand what's important to the people back home. Another thing that's great about representative democracies, like I said earlier, is that they can sort of do this without us. We can elect one person that we trust, and then they can vote on every little thing, and we can go home and do our own thing. So he says, the great advantage of representatives is their capacity to discuss public business. For this, the people as a body are quite unfitted. He is making an intellectual judgment here, but we'll get there. And this is among the greatest disadvantages of democracy. It is not at all necessary that representatives whose constituents have given them general directions await as well specific directions. So when we pick a representative, typically, we pick someone who we think will vote the way that we want them to vote. But that does not mean that we need to know what they're voting about every time. So instead of us voting on every little thing that comes up, we send someone to vote on every little thing that comes up for us. The next part is a little judgmental, but essentially his concern is that we might not be smart enough and we might not be educated enough to vote on every little thing. So maybe it's best that we send someone who's a little smarter than us to do it. So he says, although few men can assess precisely the qualifications of candidates for office, nevertheless, everyone can know in general whether or not the person he chooses is better informed than the other candidates. So even though we might not all know the complete resume behind every single candidate, we can tell, especially in a debate, which one we think is best, which one we think is smartest, and we vote for that person instead of deciding everything ourselves. So representatives are very important. Like I said earlier, though, Montesquieu is not confident in every single citizen. So one of the things that he thinks is important is that people participate in the government, but not at every level. And in fact, that we leave some of the dumber people at home. So he says, in the separate districts, all citizens ought to have the right to choose their representatives by election. Yeah. They should enter into government only to the extent of choosing representatives, something which is very much within their reach. So this is pretty patronizing, but essentially his argument here is that we're good enough to elect representatives, even if we're not good enough to know exactly what those representatives are talking about every day. Next, we take a hard right turn into classism. And we kind of knew this was coming, right? It comes up over and over in our readings, and also Montesquieu himself was incredibly wealthy and incredibly well educated, and it was his sincere belief that essentially the wealthy have different concerns than everybody else. So this is kind of what he says about distinguished people. In every state, there are always some people distinguished from the rest by their birth, wealth, or honors. If combined indiscriminately with the people, so that everyone counted equally, such common liberty would constitute slavery for the distinguished. Their share in legislation ought to be in proportion to the other advantages they enjoy in the state. So essentially he's arguing the poor people might make bad decisions about the rich people because they don't even know what the rich people are going through. And also that sometimes the rich people are just better than all the other people, and so they shouldn't be held down by the masses. Again, this should sound familiar because Aristotle talked about this as well. This concept that democracy really values the poor over the rich because there just are more poor. So Montesquieu's solution to this problem is that the distinguished should have their own Congress. So he says that basically there should be one Congress for the poor and one Congress for the rich. The power to legislate will be entrusted to both the body of nobles and to the body chosen to represent the people. Each will assemble and deliberate separately. Each will have its own views and interests. So here he was really imagining two separate governing bodies. One that is made up of the nobles, the aristocrats, the wealthy, and one that is made up of the chosen representatives, the people who were elected by the commoners. And again, he thinks that they're going to have different concerns. They're going to think about things differently, they're going to want different laws, and probably that will end up having different laws for different people, which everybody else has said is bad. But essentially, this is his argument that this kind of wealth changes you as a person, it changes your education, and it changes what you're concerned about. So the separate special Congress should be hereditary. And this might sound familiar if you've ever paid any attention to the way that the French houses used to do it, or the way that the British houses sometimes still do it in terms of like the House of Lords. You wouldn't be elected, you would just inherit the right to make those kind of decisions. So he says, the body of nobles ought to be hereditary. In the first place, it is so by nature. Which is correct. All of these titles are inherited, and again, wealth often inherited. What is more, it ought to be given a very considerable interest in maintaining its prerogatives. By that he means they should be given a lot of power to do what they think needs to be done. So, this is a mess, but you could argue that we do already do this. So the first thing to consider is that, for instance, the wealthy do have different concerns than the rest of us. And the second thing to consider is that we're kind of doing this in practice. So let's look at some graphs. In this first graph, we're looking at the specifically American distribution of aggregate household wealth. And so what that means is we're looking at how much wealth each quintile has here. So basically it's broken into the bottom 50% of earners, the next 40%, the next 9%, and the top 1%. So you'll notice here that the bottom 50% of America, basically, is so low down there that for a moment they actually disappear. I am part of this percentile. I have technically negative wealth because my student loans outweigh my, liquid wealth. That's the bottom half of everybody. You'll notice that the next 40%, so we're looking at 90% of the American population, is still only about 30% of the wealth. The majority of the wealth is held by the top 10%, and you can see that even half of that is just held by the top 1%. So yes, the wealthy are different from the rest of us. They have much more money. In this graph, we can see that a lot of that money is inherited. So one thing that's interesting about America is that not all wealth is inherited. We actually have a relatively low number of inherited amounts. So basically a little more than 50% of our wealth is probably inherited, and the rest is made in one generation. So of the very most wealthy people, a lot of them did make their own money, but they are certainly going to pass that down to their babies. In this final graph, we're looking at the general wealth of Senate members versus the general wealth of House of Representative members. And the important thing to notice here is that yes, the Senate is typically a little bit wealthier than members of the House, but the other important thing to notice here is that this scale starts at $800,000 a year. So, if you were wondering if we have a separate governing body who are wealthier than us and have separate concerns than us, we do. We're not supposed to, because we do elect these people, but as we discussed over the course of the semester, very often you have to have wealth to run in the first place. So it sounds dumb that Montesquieu says that we should have a separate governing body for the super wealthy, but maybe we already do. Next, we get back to the somewhat more reasonable part. So he's still concerned with Congress, and the next thing that he wants to talk about is that we should decide how often the Congress meets. And this is an interesting argument, and one that I hadn't thought about before, so I like this part. He argues that the legislation should meet occasionally, but not all the time. So how often should they meet? If the legislative power were to go without meeting for a considerable time, there would no longer be any liberty. So essentially his argument here is that if they don't get together at least every once in a while, it would almost be like having no laws, because we wouldn't know what the laws are, and the laws might become outdated, and we might start enforcing just some random stuff. So basically they should meet pretty regularly, otherwise we run the risk of tyranny. However, they shouldn't meet all the time. He doesn't want the legislative branch to be always in session. He says it would serve no purpose to have the legislative body always in session. So essentially, they should come together at regular intervals, make some laws, and go back home. And this was how they did it in the beginning in America, but these days they meet a little bit more regularly. They do still have huge, long breaks. They tend to take the whole summer off, but they don't meet all the time. The next part is kind of interesting, though. Sure, they should meet sometimes, and sure, they should meet all the time, but how often should they meet and when? And he argues that we should not let them decide that for themselves. He says the legislative body ought not meet at its own initiative. And his concern here is that they might meet never. They might just decide that none of those days work for them. They might meet in secret and just not tell anybody. Or they might have secret meetings from each other, so that essentially half of them might meet and leave the other half out. So in that regard, he thinks, yes, they should meet sometimes, and that time should be determined by someone else. Who, you ask? The executive branch. Thus, it ought be the executive power, which, on the basis of what it knows about the circumstances, sets the time and duration of legislative meetings. So essentially, the president should decide when they meet and how long and how often. And this is actually a pretty good system, because the president, again, in theory, knows what's going on in the world and knows when they need to get together to make more laws. So again, the executive power determines when the legislative branch meets. It's not totally illogical. So now we get into my favorite part, checks and balances. So similar to the way in the first part he described how you shouldn't combine any two branches, in this part he describes how different branches should have power over other branches. So not only should they not be combined, some of them should be able to control the other ones, kind of like an epic game of rock, paper, scissors. So he starts with the executive versus the legislative branch, and he says, if the executive does not have the power to check the designs of the legislative, this body would become despotic. For if it could arrogate to itself all the power it wished, then it would annihilate all the other powers. So his concern is that the legislative branch will pass a law that says basically we're the kings now and no one will be able to stop them. So his solution for this is that the executive should serve as a check on the legislative. That essentially the executive should have veto power. So that if the legislative branch comes up with something that is just not tenable, the executive can kind of stomp it down. Next, he talks about the legislative and the executive. It does not follow that as a matter of reciprocity, the legislative ought to have the power to check the executive. For there are limits to what the executive power can do, and these derive from its very nature. So it is unnecessary to set further bounds. We'll talk about this one. This one doesn't make quite as much sense as the others, at least in terms of its face value. But essentially he's arguing that even though the executive can check the legislative, we want to be careful about the legislative checking the executive. That essentially, again, if we give the legislative too much power, they might sort of steamroll over everybody else. So yes, the legislative should have a check on their power, but they shouldn't be able to just stomp all over the executive branch. Then we get to this idea of why the executive branch needs to be checked by the legislative branch. And that's because if the monarch, the executive branch in this case, were to participate in legislation by his power to make laws, there would no longer be any liberty. So again, here he's just kind of reinforcing this idea. Yes, there have to be checks and balances, but the legislative branch has to be able to stop the executive branch sometimes, and the executive branch has to be able to stop the legislative branch sometimes. So there's veto power, and also there's this control that the monarch can't just make his own laws, because again, that could get out of hand fast. Checks and balances. One of the reasons that Montesquieu doesn't want the legislative branch to be able to check the executive branch is that he thinks that the executive should be held in a kind of regard, that we kind of should trust whoever is the king, and we shouldn't be too hard on him. So he says, the legislative body ought not to have the power to judge the personal acts or the official conduct of the individual entrusted with the executive power. His person ought to be sacred, because it is necessary to the state that the legislative body not become tyrannical. From the moment this person is accused or judged, liberty is no more. What a timely issue. So essentially his argument is that we don't want to judge the executive too closely. Like, we don't want to get too deeply involved in their personal acts. He thinks we shouldn't get too involved in their official acts. That's up for some debate. But essentially his argument is that if the legislative branch starts to roll over the executive branch, we do run the risk of tyranny once again. And remember, he's obsessed with freedom for the people. So even though we're not supposed to judge the executive too badly, he might have some friends, and maybe we should judge them. Whoever holds executive power cannot abuse it without the aid of evil counselors, who, serving him as ministers, detest all laws. These counselors may be investigated and punished, and this is an advantage of this government. So even if we leave the executive branch alone, he probably didn't do all that bad stuff by himself. He probably had a lot of help. He might have had a lot of associates, all of whom are currently up on federal charges or in prison or being charged for international crimes. Sometimes that happens, doesn't it? So even if we can't get mad at somebody while they're in office, or even if, as Montesquieu thinks, we shouldn't hold people accountable while they're in office, we can hold their evil counselors accountable. And sometimes we do. Next, we examine the checks and balances between the judicial and the legislative branch. In general, the judicial power ought not to be joined to any part of the legislative. However, this principle is subject to 3 exceptions, all deriving from the individual interest of the defendant. So essentially, again, we don't want the people who make the laws and the people who judge the guilt of individuals to get conflated, except in a couple of examples, and this is them. Number 1, he believes that rich people cannot get a fair trial from poor people. So again, he's kind of talking about that court of nobles, and so he wants rich people who come up for, crimes, get ready for their trials, to be tried by the nobles themselves. Second, a judge might need to adjust the severity of a punishment. So sometimes the legislative branch makes a law, and they make a punishment for that law, but it might be a little bit too severe. So sometimes a judge, he thinks, will need to intervene to make it a little less severe, maybe a little more matching of the crime itself. We see this occasionally with commuted sentences and things like that. Third, if an official breaks a law in an official capacity. So in this case, he's talking about if somebody is breaking a law but it's part of their job, he thinks that they need to be tried in a different way than everybody else. So this is not wholly illogical, but basically his argument is they should not intercede, but occasionally the judicial branch is going to need to overweigh the legislative branch just a little bit. The next part is about the army. And this part is kind of weird, but whatever. Basically, he's concerned that the armed forces should be subject to some branches, but maybe not subject to other branches, which is a logical concern. So first, we look at the armed forces and the executive branch. To prevent the executive power from being able to oppress, the armies confided to it must be made up from the people and have its spirit. So essentially, the army needs to belong to the people and not to the executive branch. We can't just have a ruler who has his own army. That could get very dangerous, very tyrannical, very fast. They might cook up a bunch of plots and plan a civil war. We don't want that. However, we also don't want the army subject to the legislative branch. And Montesquieu's argument here is a little weird. He basically says that the army wouldn't respect the legislative branch, I guess because they're dorky. But he says, once an army has been established, it ought to depend not directly upon the legislative body, but upon the executive power. As soon as an army takes orders directly from the legislative body, the government will become dominated by the military. It, the military, will disregard orders emanating from a body whose members it believes to be timid and therefore unworthy of commanding an army. So essentially, the legislative branch can't be in charge of the army, because they could just make a bunch of laws that say, like, the army shoots everyone we don't like. And that would be dangerous. But the army does still have to respect the people who give the orders. So for that reason, they think that the army should be subject to the executive power, but not totally under the will of the executive power. So again, checks and balances. Essentially, there must be an army. It can't be owned wholly by the president. It has to still be made up of the people, but it can't be armed by the legislative power either. So there must be an army, but it must be made up of people and subject to checks and balances. So now we get to Montesquieu's final thought, and it's a good one. Here then is the fundamental constitution of the government being discussed. These three powers ought to produce repose or inaction, but since the nature of things requires movement, all three powers are obliged to act and to act together. So essentially, when you divide the power into three chunks and you give them these checks and balances, you do run the risk of inaction. If all three branches are mad at each other, they can just refuse to get anything done. But if all three branches work together, then you can get all sorts of things done. So it's important to divide your power up because you do not want a despot. It's important to have checks and balances because you want to make sure that no one branch gets too much control. But it's especially important that all three branches work together to create a functional, working government. So, I'm looking forward to talking about Montesquieu with you this week, and I'll see you soon.